The moment Delia Conley stepped off the stagecoach in Redemption, Texas, with nothing but a battered carpetbag and a heart full of careful hope, a gunshot cracked through the dry afternoon air and sent every pigeon on the depot roof scattering into the cloudless sky of 1878. She did not scream. She had made a private promise to herself somewhere back in Missouri that she would not be the kind of woman who screamed anymore. She had done enough of that in her old life, the life she had ridden away from on borrowed courage and a one-way ticket. So instead she pressed herself flat against the rough timber wall of the stage depot, carpetbag clutched to her chest, and watched the street with wide, steady brown eyes. A man came sprinting out of the Redemption Savings and Loan across the dusty Main Street, a canvas sack swinging from one fist. Behind him, two more men on horseback wheeled their animals in tight, nervous circles, shouting things Delia could not quite make out over the drumbeat of hooves. People scattered in every direction, women pulling children into doorways, a barber ducking behind his red and white pole. And then, from the far end of the street, a single rider came at a full gallop. He was tall in the saddle, that was the first thing she noticed, with the kind of effortless seat that told you the horse, and the man had been one creature for a long time. He wore a sun-darkened hat with a crease down the center of the crown, a faded blue work shirt, and a sheriff's star that caught the afternoon light like a small, bright promise. He rode straight at the chaos without the slightest hesitation, one hand already up and extended, voice carrying clean across the distance between them. "Drop it, Harlan. Drop it right now, and we end this without anybody going in the ground today." There was a moment, a long, suspended second where the world seemed to hold its breath. Then the man with the canvas sack looked at the rider coming for him, looked at the two horses behind him already beginning to bolt, and made the sensible choice. The sack hit the dirt. The man's hands went up. Delia let out a slow breath. It took another 20 minutes for the sheriff to sort the whole business out, get the money back inside the bank, hand the three men off to his deputy, and settle his horse at the hitching rail in front of the depot. By that time the street had come back to life around her, ordinary afternoon sounds filling in the gaps left by the excitement, and Delia was still exactly where she had been, back against the wall, watching. He noticed her because she was the only person on the street still standing still. He came across toward her with his hat already in his hand, which she thought was a good sign about a man, that his first instinct when approaching a woman alone was to remove his hat. "Ma'am, you all right? That was poor welcoming to our town, and I apologize for it." His voice was lower up close, with a roughness that came from years of being outdoors and not enough water. He had dark eyes, almost black in the afternoon shadow cast by the depot roof, and a jaw that had not seen a razor in 2 or 3 days. He was older than her by maybe 6 or 7 years, she guessed, which put him somewhere in his early 30s. He was not what she would have called handsome in a magazine illustration sort of way, but there was something in his face that was completely honest, and Delia had learned over the course of her 25 years that honesty in a face was worth considerably more than beauty. "I am fine," she said. "Are the people in the bank fine?" He blinked, as though he had not expected her first question to be about someone other than herself. "Yes, ma'am. Nobody hurt. Harlan Briggs has tried that particular robbery twice before, and he has never quite worked out that the teller keeps the actual money in a back safe he can't reach." Canvas sack was full of deposit ledgers. A corner of his mouth moved upward. Not the most profitable afternoon in his career. Despite herself, Delia felt her own mouth soften. "I am looking for the sheriff's office," she said. "I was told to present myself there when I arrived. I am Delia Conley." Something shifted in his expression, a small, careful rearrangement. "From the advertisement," he said. It was not a question. "From the advertisement," she confirmed. He put his hat back on, slow and deliberate, and she had the distinct impression he was using those few seconds to compose himself. "Then, I am the man you have come all this way to meet, John Abbott." He extended his hand, and when she took it, his grip was firm and brief and completely respectful. I expect you are tired and hungry and would rather not conduct any sort of formal conversation in the street. I would rather not, she agreed. Then let me take your bag and get you over to the boarding house. Mrs. Fitch runs on Pecan Street. She is expecting you. And then, when you have rested, I would be glad to have supper with you and let you decide whether redemption is somewhere you might want to stay. He said it simply, without performance or pressure, and that, more than anything else that had happened in those first 10 minutes, was what made Delia Conley think that coming here might not have been the worst decision of her life. She handed him her carpetbag. The advertisement had been plain enough. 4 lines in a Kansas City newspaper that had somehow made its way to the rooming house in St. Joseph, where Delia had been living for 9 months after leaving her marriage. She had left her husband on a Tuesday in November of 1877, and she was not ashamed of it, though she understood that the world around her largely expected her to be. He had not been a cruel man, not in any dramatic way that left marks people could point at. He had simply been absent, first in his attention, then in his time, and finally, one gray morning when she had woken up and realized she did not recognize herself in the small mirror above the washstand, absent from anything she had ever needed him to be. She had packed quietly and left a note, and used the last of the household money she had been carefully setting aside for 8 months. The advertisement had read, "Widower, Sheriff, 32, ranching land outside Redemption, Texas, seeks honest woman of steady character for companionship and eventual marriage. Children welcome but not required. Correspondence welcomed first. No pretenses. No pretenses." That was what had made her write back. They had exchanged 4 letters over 3 months. His were short and direct. Hers were longer and more careful. But over the course of those 12 weeks something had begun to emerge between the lines, something she could not quite name but recognized the way you recognize a song from childhood, by the feeling of it rather than the words. He had told her about his ranch in the second letter, about the house that needed more life in it, about his horse Calico and the 2 ranch hands who worked for him. He had told her about his wife, Clara, who had died of fever 3 years before, and he had not tried to make the telling either romantic or tragic, just true. She had told him about St. Joseph and her work as a seamstress and what she was good at and what she was not, and that she could cook tolerably but not brilliantly, and that she was not afraid of hard work. She had not told him about her first marriage. Not yet. Mrs. Fitch's boarding house was a 2-story white frame building with a garden that was attempting something ambitious with roses along the front porch. The woman herself was round and brisk and entirely capable of assessing a person in 30 seconds, which she did to Delia the moment John carried her carpetbag through the front door. "You'll do," Mrs. Fitch announced, which Delia gathered was high praise. "Rooms on the 2nd floor, east-facing, catches the morning light. Supper's at 6, but since you've had a journey, I'll leave a cold plate and some biscuits in your room." She fixed John with a look that had some mothering in it and some warning at the same time. "You be decent to this one, John Abbott." "I intend to be," he said quietly. Delia watched him leave from the 2nd-floor window, watched him untie his horse from the post across the street and lead it rather than ride it, his hat slightly pushed back on his head. She stood there for longer than she intended, and when she finally turned back to the room with its clean cotton quilt and the vase of dried wildflowers on the window ledge, she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Curious. She felt genuinely, cautiously curious about what came next. Supper happened at the small restaurant 2 doors down from the stage depot, a place called Harmon's that smelled of wood smoke and beef, and the beeswax someone used on the tables. John was already there when she arrived, sitting with his hat on the bench beside him and a cup of coffee in front of him, and he stood when he saw her come through the door, which again she filed away as a point in his favor. They sat across from each other and ordered the beef stew with cornbread because the proprietor, a lean man named Harmon who looked as though he sampled his own cooking rarely, said it was what was good tonight. For a moment they simply looked at each other across the table with the candid awkwardness of two people who have written letters to one another for months and are now trying to reconcile the person they had constructed in their imagination with the actual human being sitting 3 feet away. "You are younger than I pictured," he said finally. "You are more serious," she replied. "Is that a problem?" She considered it genuinely. "Not if serious means you mean what you say." "It does," he said. She nodded slowly, then no. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup, and she noticed his hands the way she always noticed hands first, large, scarred across the knuckles of the right one in a way that suggested either hard work or a past disagreement with something that hit back, steady and still. "I want to be honest with you about what this is and what it isn't," he said. "The advertisement was the truth. I am not a man who does well with being alone. I have the ranch, and I have my work, and I have Calico, and I have two of the best ranch hands in the county, but the house is quiet in a way that has started to feel wrong. I am not asking you to be anything other than who you are." I thought I should say that plainly. Delia set down her own cup carefully. "I need to be honest with you about something as well," she said. "I was married before. The letters I wrote you did not include that, and I want to explain why before you decide anything." She met his eyes directly because she had promised herself she would not look away from the hard things anymore. "I left him. He is alive and living in independence. It was not a violent situation, but it was not a good marriage, and I made the choice to end it, and I stand by that choice. I understand if that changes your thinking." John Abbott was quiet for a moment, and she could see him processing it, not reacting, just thinking, which she appreciated more than she could say. "It doesn't change my thinking," he said. "It tells me you know your own mind, which is more useful than a spotless history." Something in her chest loosened just slightly, like a knot that had been pulled slightly less tight. The beef stew arrived and they talked through it, real talking, the kind that moved around and doubled back and went somewhere neither of them had planned. He told her about growing up in East Texas, about how he had come west at 18 to work cattle, about how he had found redemption mostly by accident and stayed, because the land had agreed with him in some fundamental way. She told him about growing up in a family of 5 sisters in a farmhouse outside Hannibal, Missouri, about how she had always been the one who wanted to know what was past the next ridge, which had not made her an easy daughter. He laughed at that, not a performance of a laugh but a real one, brief and warm, and she thought it changed his whole face when it happened. By the time Harmon brought apple pie, they had not solved anything and had not tried to, but they had established something quieter and more substantial than solutions. They had established that they liked each other. That was enough for a first evening. He walked her back to Mrs. Fitch's, the street quiet and cool and scattered with stars in the wide Texas sky, and at the front gate of the boarding house he stopped and turned to face her with the honest directness that was, she was beginning to understand, simply how he was built. "I'd like to show you the ranch tomorrow if you're willing. You should see what you'd be coming into before you make any decisions. I don't want you agreeing to anything you haven't seen with your own eyes." "What time?" she said. 7 too early. 7 is fine." He nodded once, and for a moment neither of them moved, and Delia became very aware of the night air between them and the way the lamplight from Mrs. Fitch's porch fell across the left side of his face. Then he tipped his hat and said good night and walked back down the street with that same unhurried, deliberate stride, and she stood at the gate watching until he turned the corner. She slept better that night than she had in months. He arrived at 7 on the nose on a bay mare he had saddled for her, leading Calico alongside. Calico was a paint horse, white and brown and gray in unpredictable patterns, with a disposition that John described as opinionated. The bay was calmer. Delia had not ridden extensively since her farm childhood, but she had not lost the feel of it, and John watched her settle into the saddle with a critical eye, and then a brief nod that she understood to mean she had passed some test she had not known she was taking. The ranch was 4 miles outside town, south along a creek that moved slowly through the morning stillness. The Texas landscape opened around her as they rode, wide and bronze gold in the summer heat, scattered with mesquite and live oak and the occasional sudden burst of wildflowers. It was not the lush, close country she had grown up in. It was bigger and more demanding, a landscape that required something from you simply to stand in it. "You don't find it too much?" she asked, gesturing at the vast reach of it. "I find it exactly right," he said, and then glanced at her. "Some people don't. That's a fair thing to know about yourself before you decide. I think I might find it exactly right too," she said slowly. "I haven't decided yet." The corner of his mouth moved. "Fair." The ranch house was a single story, longer than it was tall, built from a combination of timber and caliche stone with a covered porch that wrapped around three sides. A kitchen garden ran along the east wall, somewhat ragged and in need of attention. There was a large barn, a smaller outbuilding that served as quarters for the two ranch hands, and a corral where 4 horses moved in the morning light. The whole arrangement had the look of a place that was functional and cared for, but that had been maintained, rather than loved for some years. One of the ranch hands, a young man named Emilio who Delia guessed was about 19, came out of the barn when they rode in and removed his hat with a speed and sincerity that made her like him immediately. The other, an older man named Walt who was perhaps 50 and had a white mustache of considerable ambition, leaned on the fence post and watched her get down from the bay with an expression that told her he was reserving judgment but was not hostile. "This is Miss Conley," John said to both of them. "She has come from Missouri to see if this place suits her." "It's a good place," Emilio said earnestly, looking at Delia. "Mr. Abbott keeps it real decent." "I can see that," she said warmly. Walt said nothing but gave a short nod, which she suspected was his version of a welcome. John showed her through the house room by room with the same unhurried honesty he brought to everything, naming what worked and what didn't, pointing out the window in the back bedroom that stuck in the humidity, the chimney in the main room that drew beautifully, the kitchen with its good iron stove, and the pantry that could have been better organized. She asked practical questions. How deep was the well? What was the situation with the nearest doctor? Did the road to town wash out in spring floods? He answered each one directly and without decoration. They sat on the front porch afterward with water from the kitchen, and the silence between them was comfortable in a way that surprised her, because comfortable silences were not something she had experienced much of with people she had known for less than 24 hours. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think it's a good house," she said carefully. "I think the kitchen garden needs saving, but it can be saved. I think the porch faces exactly the right direction for evenings." She paused. "I think I would like more time before I can tell you whether I am the right person to be here." He nodded slowly. "That seems reasonable. How long can Mrs. Fitch keep my room?" "I spoke with her this morning. She said as long as you need." Delia looked at him, this quiet, direct, sun-browned man who had thought to arrange that before she even asked. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in a way that went beyond the courtesy of the words. She stayed at Mrs. Fitch's for 2 weeks, and during those 2 weeks she and John saw each other every day, though not always for long and not always in any formal way. He would appear at the boarding house some mornings with a spare horse and they would ride. Other days she would walk to the mercantile or the dress shop, and find him at the sheriff's office when she passed, and they would talk through the open window for 20 minutes about whatever was in front of them. She helped Mrs. Fitch with the roses because she needed something to do with her hands, and she sat in on a quilting circle at the church because the minister's wife, a kind and sensible woman named Ruth Caldwell, had invited her, and it seemed important to understand a town before you decided whether to plant yourself in it. Redemption, she learned, was a town of some 400 people in a county of a few thousand more, growing slowly but not in a hurry about it. There was a history there, some of it complicated and some of it ugly, as there was in every western town in that era. The land had been taken from the Comanche who had worked the territory for generations, and that taking was a wound that did not close simply because nobody talked about it in polite company. She heard the name of more than one Apache or Comanche man spoken with a contempt that made her jaw tighten. She heard stories about range wars and fence cuttings, and a feud between two cattle families that had ended badly the year before. The town had been a harder place than it currently presented, and some of that hardness was still in the soil of it, the way bitterness stays in the ground after a long drought. John, she noticed, spoke about all of it plainly. He did not pretend the history was cleaner than it was. When she asked him about the Apache family that lived in a camp 2 miles north of town, a small group that had not followed the main removal because of a sick elder who could not travel, his answer was careful and honest. "They have a right to the land the same as anyone," he said. "More, if we are being truthful about it. There are people in town who disagree with me on that. It has caused some friction. But I am the law here, and I intend for the law to apply equally, or it applies to nothing." She filed that away with everything else she was learning about him, this steady, honest man with his scarred knuckles and his paint horse and his house that needed more life in it. On the 14th day, she walked to the sheriff's office herself, in the middle of a hot August afternoon, and sat down across from his desk without being invited, which made his eyebrows rise slightly. "I want to stay," she said. "I have thought about it carefully, and I do not want to keep thinking about it because thinking too long has always been the way I have talked myself out of the right things. So I am telling you now, if the offer still stands." John Abbott set down the report he had been reading, placed both palms flat on the desk, and looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not entirely read except that it was warm and somewhat unguarded, more open than his face usually allowed itself. "The offer stands," he said. "Good," she said. "Then I suggest we do this properly, in the fall, if that is agreeable." "September," he offered. "September is fine." She stood up and so did he, and they were standing on opposite sides of the desk, and neither of them moved for a moment. And then she extended her hand across it the same way he had extended his to her on that first afternoon in the street. And he took it, and held it for just a breath longer than a handshake required. They were married on the 14th of September, 1878, in the small white church on the east side of Redemption, with Ruth Caldwell in the front pew beaming and Walt standing in the back with his hat in his hands looking quietly satisfied, and Emilio in the second row, in a new shirt that was slightly too large for him and very clearly his best. "Mrs. Fitch cried, which surprised Delia because she had not taken the woman for a crier, but then she supposed love made its demands regardless of temperament. The minister, whose name was Caldwell as well, being Ruth's husband Thomas, conducted the ceremony with an economy of words that Delia appreciated. John said his vows without looking away from her, which she had hoped for and had not been sure of until the moment came. She said her own with the same directness, looking straight back into those dark eyes, and when Thomas Caldwell pronounced them married and John bent his head and kissed her once, brief and certain, she felt the last careful defense around her heart shift and soften like adobe in rain. They drove out to the ranch afterward in the wagon John had brought in from the property, Emilio having decorated it that morning with wildflowers in a way that was clearly heartfelt if not entirely systematic. The evening was deep gold and long, the way September evenings in Texas could be, and the land around them was cooling slightly from the day's heat, the mesquite casting long shadows across the track. "I want to tell you something," Delia said as they came through the gate of the property. John kept his eyes on the track. "All right. I was not looking for safety when I came here. I think sometimes people assume that is why a woman makes an arrangement like this, because she needs protecting or providing for. And I want you to know that was not what this was for me. I came because I was looking for something real, and I have found it." She paused. "I wanted you to know the difference." He was quiet for long enough that she wondered if she had said something wrong, and then he pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and turned to look at her in the evening light and said, "I know the difference. I was looking for the same thing." The early months of their marriage were the kind of thing Delia later found she could not describe easily to anyone who had not lived through them, because What she would have needed to say was that they were both beautiful and difficult and ordinary all at once, which was not a very satisfying thing to hear, but was entirely true. They were learning each other. Not the version of each other that appeared in letters or across a supper table, but the real, daily, sometimes maddening version, the one that existed at 6 in the morning when nobody was performing anything. She learned that he woke before dawn every day without difficulty, and that this habit was completely unconscious. He learned that she was not a morning person in any meaningful sense until she had coffee in her hand, and adjusted accordingly by ensuring the coffee was ready before he came back in from the early chores. She learned that he had a short, contained temper that expressed itself not in raised voices, but in a quality of stillness that was worse than shouting, and she learned to give him 20 minutes in that stillness before she approached it. He learned that she would work herself past the point of sense rather than ask for help, which he found maddening, and he told her so directly, which she appreciated even as she argued with him about it. She saved the kitchen garden by November, which gave her a disproportionate satisfaction. She reorganized the pantry in October, which gave John a slightly panicked 20 minutes before he found the coffee, and they had their first real argument about it, which ended with both of them laughing against their own wills, which she thought was a good sign. She made changes to the house slowly and thoughtfully, never wholesale, never in a way that would have made it feel like someone else's place, but in small increments that softened it and gave it more warmth. A better lamp in the main room. Curtains in the kitchen window. A rag rug she braided herself from worn-out clothing over the course of 3 weeks, which Walt, who never said anything, looked at once and said, "That's real nice," and went back outside. The women of Redemption were, on the whole, welcoming. Ruth Caldwell had been the first to be genuine, and the others followed her lead. There was a population of women in the town in similar circumstances, wives of ranchers and tradesmen and the sheriff, women who had come from other places and were building lives in the same way Delia was, plank by plank. She liked most of them. She found her place among them the way you find your footing on an unfamiliar stair, one step at a time. There was one woman who was less welcoming, a widow named Helen Prescott, who had made no secret before Delia arrived that she had considered herself a candidate for John's affection. Delia understood this and did not hold it against her, but she also did not go out of her way to smooth it over in any artificial way. They were civil. It was sufficient. The thing that complicated December was not Helen Prescott. It was a man named Curtis Wade. Wade arrived in Redemption on a cold Wednesday with 2 men who had the look of hired muscle, and he went directly to the sheriff's office to introduce himself as a representative of the Consolidated Land Trust, which was what powerful Eastern money called itself when it came west to eat smaller properties. He wanted to speak about John's ranch. Specifically, he wanted to discuss an offer to purchase it at a price that was half its value, but delivered with the confidence of a man who expected not to be refused. John heard him out and said no. Wade smiled the way men smile when they consider a no to be a temporary condition. "I would encourage you to reconsider, Sheriff. We have made this offer to several of the ranchers in the county. Those who have accepted have found the arrangement profitable. Those who have declined have subsequently found operations more difficult." "That sounds like a threat," John said evenly. "It sounds like an observation about how business tends to operate," Wade replied. John showed them out. He told Delia about it that evening at supper, and she listened without interrupting, cutting her biscuit and watching his face. When he finished, she said, "What are you going to do?" "What I always do. My job. He doesn't own anything in this county that changes my authority, whatever he thinks. And the ranchers who haven't refused." "The smaller ones," he met her eyes. "I've been thinking about that." "So have I," she said. "We should speak to them." It was not something he had planned to ask her to be involved in, she could tell, not because he wanted to exclude her, but because it had simply not occurred to him that she would want to be. She watched him recalibrate, and she gave him a moment to do it. "You're right," he said. "We should." Over the following 2 weeks, they rode out together to 6 neighboring ranches and 3 smaller properties on the edge of town, talking to people, listening, gathering an understanding of what Wade and his trust were doing across the county. The picture that emerged was not subtle. They were targeting the most economically vulnerable properties first, using a combination of offers and pressure, and in 2 cases, what seemed to be deliberate interference with water rights that had to be challenged through the county court. It was the kind of slow, grinding dispossession that did not look like violence until you added up all its pieces. On Christmas Eve, someone cut the fence line on the north pasture of the Abbott ranch and drove off 14 head of cattle. Walt found it at first light and came to the house with his hat in his hand and a look on his face that told the whole story before he opened his mouth. John saddled Calico before Delia could say a word. She followed him to the barn. "I am coming with you," she said. "Delia, I am not a liability. I can ride and I can track and I know this land as well as you do by now. And 4 eyes are better than 2. A pause. "Ride the bay," he said, "and stay behind me if there is any trouble." They found the cattle 3 miles north, gathered in a draw on open range with evidence that someone had planned to move them further but had perhaps been interrupted. John turned them back toward the property with Walt and Emilio's help, while Delia worked the perimeter of the draw, reading the ground in the cold morning light. She was not a professional tracker, but she was observant, and she found what she found. 3 riders, she said when John came back to where she was crouching. "And this." She showed him the brand mark on a fence post someone had left behind, a combined CT for Consolidated Trust, which was not the subtlest message in the history of messages. John took the post and looked at it for a long time. "They want me to react," he said. "Come at them loud and give Wade a reason to talk about the aggressive sheriff with a grudge. Then do not give it to them," she said. He looked at her. "That's harder than it sounds." "I know," she said, "but you are better than loud." They rode home in the cold Christmas morning, and she made breakfast, and they were quiet with each other for most of it, the comfortable quiet of 2 people thinking in parallel. And when Emilio came in from the barn with a sprig of cedar he had tied a piece of red cloth to in an attempt at a Christmas decoration, they were both grateful for the interruption and the small, ordinary warmth of it. January brought a development that shifted everything. Delia had suspected it since the middle of December, but had not been certain enough to say anything. By January, she was certain. She waited for an evening when the weather kept them both inside, when John was sitting by the lamp reading the latest sheriff's dispatches from Austin, and she was hemming a pair of his work trousers, and she set the trousers down and said his name. He looked up. "We are going to have a child," she said. The stillness that came over him was not the contained temper kind of stillness. It was something entirely different. He set the papers down very carefully and looked at her across the firelit room with an expression she had not seen on his face before, open and unguarded and stunned in the most careful, reverent way. "You're sure?" he said, very quietly. "I am sure." He was beside her on the settee before she had finished the second syllable. Not dramatically, not with grand gestures, just there, his arm around her with a solidity that felt like the house itself, like something that was simply and reliably where it was supposed to be. She rested her head on his shoulder and felt his breath slow and steady and then slightly unsteady, and she realized with a startling tenderness that he was trying very hard not to show that he was moved and that the effort was costing him. "John," she said. "I'm all right," he said, in a voice that confirmed he was and was not. "You don't have to be composed about this," she said. "Not with me." He turned his head and pressed his lips to her hair and held them there for a long moment. "Clara and I tried for 3 years," he said softly. "And then she was gone. I had told myself I had made my peace with." He stopped. "I hadn't quite." She put her hand over his and stayed exactly where she was, and outside the wind was cold off the prairie, and inside the fire was warm, and something in the house had changed in the best possible way, as though it had finally been told what it was for. February saw Curtis Wade make a second approach. this time not to John but to Emilio, whom he encountered alone at the feed store and attempted to bribe into providing information about the ranch's eastern water access points. Emilio came home white-faced and shaking with anger, and described the conversation to John in careful detail, including every word he could remember, which was most of them because Emilio, beneath his gentle demeanor, had an excellent memory and was paying attention. John filed a formal report with the county seat at Austin. He was not certain how much weight it would carry against Consolidated's money, but he filed it carefully and completely, noting every instance and date and name, because a record was a record and juries and judges eventually had to reckon with them. He also went to speak with a man named Amos Bellard, who was an attorney in town and who had spent 20 years in Eastern courts before coming to Texas for reasons he kept vague, but which had something to do with preferring honesty to advancement. Bellard read John's report with a careful eye and then took off his spectacles and cleaned them, which was apparently how he thought. "You have enough for a civil suit against interference with water rights," he said. "Maybe enough for more if we can tie the cattle drive to them directly. The brand marker is helpful." "I want it done right," John said. "No shortcuts." "Shortcuts are how men like Wade operate," Bellard said. "Doing it right is exactly what beats them in my experience." Delia had come along to that meeting and sat quietly in the corner of Bellard's office taking her own notes, because she was organized and thorough, and because 2 sets of notes were better than 1. Bellard glanced at her more than once during the conversation with the expression of a man recalibrating his expectations pleasantly. "Your wife is quite sharp," he said to John as they left. "I know," John said simply. Spring arrived and the ranch came into its best season, the pastures greening after rain and the kitchen garden producing in earnest and the horses glossy and well settled in the corral. Delia's pregnancy was showing now, past the point of being hidden, and the physical fact of it had changed something in both of them in ways that were hard to articulate but were present in every room. She caught him watching her sometimes with a look that was so bare and so warm that she had to look away and then look back, because she could not quite believe it was directed at her. She told him that one evening, direct as always. "Sometimes I cannot quite believe you look at me the way you do." He was quiet for a moment. "What way is that?" "Like you mean it," she said simply. He set down his coffee cup and crossed the room and sat beside her and took her face in both his hands gently, carefully, the way you hold something you are genuinely afraid of dropping, and said, "Delia, I have meant everything with you since the beginning, every word, every day. You should be in no doubt about that." She was not in doubt after that, not in the way she had described, the small, corroded kind that comes from years of not being seen. She had been seen. She was being seen. It was the most quietly astonishing experience of her life. The legal case against Consolidated Land Trust moved through the spring with the deliberate pace of courts everywhere, which was maddening in its slowness and eventually and unexpectedly satisfying in its thoroughness. Amos Bellard was, beneath his absent-minded exterior, a formidable legal mind, and he built the case against Wade's trust the way a stonemason builds a wall, one solid piece at a time, with no gaps where the wind could get in. Wade himself came to see John one March afternoon, this time alone, without his hired men, which John noticed and which he told Delia about that evening. "He came alone because he wanted to have a different kind of conversation," she said immediately. "That's what I thought," John agreed. The conversation had been, according to John, less confrontational and more probing. Wade had wanted to understand whether there was a number, some higher price, that would change John's answer. John had explained, in the calm and even tone that was his natural mode, that the question was not about price. It was about what happened to everyone else in the county if the trust ate its way through all the smaller holdings. Wade had seemed, if not persuaded, at least surprised. He had not expected the sheriff to be thinking beyond his own fence line. John was always thinking beyond his own fence line. It was one of the things Delia loved about him, this deep, unglamorous sense of responsibility that extended in every direction from where he stood and did not ask for acknowledgement. She had started to use the word love in her own thoughts by then, quietly and without fanfare, the way you start using a path through a field when you have walked it enough times that it becomes simply the way you go. She loved him. She had not said it yet. She was waiting for the right moment, or perhaps she was just a little afraid of the size of it. The right moment arrived unexpectedly in late March, on a Thursday afternoon when she was in the kitchen garden, and he came around the corner of the house and stopped dead at the sight of her. And she looked up, and the afternoon light was doing something extraordinary to the sky behind him, all copper and rose gold. And he was just standing there looking at her with those dark eyes and the small beginning of a smile. And she said, without planning to say anything, "I love you, John Abbott." He crossed the garden in 4 steps, which in retrospect was faster than she had ever seen him move for anything, and he took her hands and held them and said, "I love you, Delia." "I have been working up to saying it for 2 months, she laughed. 2 months. I was being careful about it. You are always being careful, she said, still laughing. Not always, he said, and kissed her there in the kitchen garden among the onions and the spring lettuce, long and warm and unhurried, while the Texas evening came in behind them like a benediction. Their son was born on the 23rd of June, 1879, in the bedroom with the window that stuck in the humidity, with the help of the town's doctor, a capable and matter-of-fact woman named Dr. Mary Hendricks, who had come to Redemption the previous year, and who Delia had trusted from the moment she met her, which was a testament to both of them. The labor was long and hard in the way that first labors tend to be, and John sat outside the bedroom door for most of it in a state that Walt later described to Emilio as the most scared he had ever seen the sheriff look, including the time a horse kicked him in the ribs in 1875. When Mary Hendricks opened the bedroom door and told him he had a son, and that his wife was tired but well, John went straight past her without another word and was on his knees beside the bed with Delia's hand in both of his, and she was exhausted and flushed and looked, he told her later, like the most remarkable person he had ever seen in his life. "He is going to need a name," she said when she could manage words. "I was thinking Samuel," John said, "if that suits you." She looked at the small, crumpled, miraculous face of the baby against her chest. "Samuel Abbott," she said, trying it. "Yes, that suits him." Samuel was everything the next months were organized around, in the way that new babies are organized around, joyfully and exhaustingly. He was a loud, solid, opinionated child from the beginning, which made John laugh and Delia say that it was clearly from his father's side. Walt and Emilio were besotted with him in their respective ways, Walt making the baby a small carved horse that lived on the shelf above Samuel's crib, and Emilio arriving with increasing frequency at the house on entirely transparent pretexts, because he wanted to look at the baby. Through all of it, the legal case continued. In August of 1879, 14 months after Wade had first walked into the sheriff's office, the county court ruled in favor of the ranchers of the Redemption Valley on the water rights question and ordered a formal investigation into Consolidated's practices in the county. It was not a complete victory, not the wholesale defeat of the trust's ambitions, but it was substantial and real, and it meant that the smaller ranchers who had been under pressure could breathe again. 3 of them came out to the Abbott Ranch on the day the ruling was announced, and they sat on the covered porch in the evening and drank coffee and talked about what came next. And Delia moved among them with the baby on her hip and felt something she had not felt since she was a child in her family's farmhouse in Missouri, the deep animal warmth of belonging to a place. Curtis Wade departed Redemption 2 weeks after the ruling in the company of the county marshal, who was escorting him to Austin to answer the formal investigation's questions. He did not return. The Consolidated Land Trust, facing similar legal challenges in 4 other Texas counties, where other meticulous local men and women had been building similar cases, quietly withdrew from the region within the year. It was not a dramatic ending. It was the right kind of ending, the kind that came from stubbornness and care, and the slow, unspectacular machinery of doing things correctly. Amos Bellard celebrated by cleaning his spectacles 3 times in a row, which was, for him, practically a party. The following years moved the way good years do, full of substance and ordinary event, each season bringing its own particular texture. Samuel grew from an opinionated baby into an opinionated toddler who had his father's dark eyes and his mother's absolute refusal to be deflected from a course she had decided on, which made her laugh every time she saw it in him. Walt taught him to walk before he was quite ready, in the sense that he kept putting the boy on his feet and stepping back and saying, "There now," with confident optimism. Emilio, who was now 21 and had begun courting a girl from a Mexican family in town named Rosalinda with a nervous, genuine dedication that made the whole ranch quietly root for him, taught Samuel to say his first Spanish word, which was caballo, meaning horse, which meant that the first extended word out of Samuel's mouth, to Delia's mixed amusement and embarrassment, was not mama or papa but horse. Delia took on more than she had initially planned, in the sense that her capabilities outgrew the house's demands and she let them. She began keeping the ranch's accounts, which she had a gift for, and then helping 2 of the neighboring ranchers with theirs because they were men who were comfortable with cows and uncomfortable with figures, and the combination was proving expensive for them. She started a small lending library in the front room of the sheriff's office, a project that grew from her acquiring several boxes of books from an estate sale in San Antonio, and not being able to stop herself from organizing them, and then from lending them. Ruth Caldwell called it Delia's Library, and the name stuck, and the town's children started appearing there on Saturday mornings, and then the children's mothers, and then some of the men who would not have admitted to wanting to borrow a book, but who came in on quiet weekday afternoons when nobody much was around. John watched all of this with a pride he expressed in his usual understated way, which was not to say it directly but to make sure that everyone around them understood it, to speak about her when she was not present in a way that left absolutely no room for doubt. They had a daughter in the winter of 1881. They named her Ida, after Delia's mother. She had John's calm temperament and her brother's dark eyes, and she was, from the beginning, a child who watched everything with an attention that suggested she was coming to specific conclusions. Samuel, who was 2.5 and had opinions about the importance of his own status in the household, spent the first 2 weeks of Ida's life periodically appearing beside her crib and examining her with a measuring look, and then going away again. By the 3rd week he had apparently decided she was acceptable, because he started bringing her things, small objects that were important to him, a stone with an interesting shape, one of Walt's carved horses, a piece of dried mesquite bark that he had identified as having significant value. He laid them beside her with great seriousness, and Delia watched this and felt something in her so full it bordered on physical. Emilio and Rosalinda were married in the spring of 1882, in the same church where John and Delia had been married. Delia made Rosalinda's dress, which was the most elaborate sewing project she had undertaken in years, and which she worked on in secret for 3 months, and presented to Rosalinda a week before the wedding, and the girl cried so hard that Delia cried too, which she had not expected, and then they both laughed about it. John stood up for Emilio at the ceremony with the simple, dignified warmth of a man who had watched this young person grow and was glad to be there for it. Walt sat in the front row and blew his nose once loudly, and stared straight ahead after that with great dignity. The ranch itself had grown by 1882, not aggressively, not in the trust's manner of acquisition, but in the natural way of a well-run place that makes good decisions and banks the results. They had more cattle. The kitchen garden had expanded into a proper kitchen yard. John had built an addition onto the house, a room on the south end that Delia had claimed as a combination sewing room and study, and had filled with books and organized chaos in a way that was entirely hers, and that John had never once tried to straighten. He understood instinctively that the room was not disorder but her particular kind of order, and that they were not the same thing. He understood a great many things about her by then, after 4 years of marriage. He understood that she needed space in the mornings and conversation in the evenings. He understood that her care for people expressed itself in practical action rather than words, that when someone in town was sick, she would appear with food, and when someone was struggling, she would appear with her account book and help them find the numbers. He understood that she was braver than she gave herself credit for, and that she had spent years being braver than the world around her required her to admit. He had told her this once plainly, because he was a plain-spoken man and it needed to be said, and she had gone very still when he said it, and then nodded once, in the way that meant she was putting something down that she had been carrying. She understood things about him too. She understood the weight of the responsibility he carried as the law in a place that was still, in the late 1800s, sorting out what it was. She understood the old grief for Clara that was not a wound anymore but was still a scar, present and permanent, and she had never tried to cover it or compete with it because it was part of him, and she loved all of him, which included the history. She understood that his stillness was not absence, that when he was quiet he was not gone, he was fully present in his own way, and that leaning against that stillness was something she had come to depend on in a way that was completely different from the dependency she had fled in Missouri. This was the dependency of equals, the kind that goes both ways. In 1883, John was appointed district sheriff, which meant his authority extended beyond Redemption into the broader county. It was a significant thing, and it came with complications, more travel, harder cases, a larger set of responsibilities that kept him away from the ranch more than either of them liked. They talked about it thoroughly before he accepted, the way they talked about every significant decision, at the kitchen table with coffee, going around and around it until they had seen it from every angle. "It is the right thing for you to do," Delia said finally. "You would do the job better than anyone else and you know it, and doing it for the whole county matters more than the smaller thing. It means more time away from you and the children," he said. "We will manage. And when you come home, you will come home properly, not half-present." He accepted the appointment. The broader county presented him with broader problems, and some of them were harder than Redemption's difficulties had been. There were still significant tensions along the lines of older injustices, men who used the law as a tool for dispossession where the trust had used money, and John's method was always the same, to apply the law as it was written, and to speak plainly about what it should be when it fell short. He made enemies and he made allies and he remained, stubbornly and without any apparent interest in comfort, the kind of man who could be trusted. He came home one September evening, 4 years into the district appointment, and found Delia on the porch with Samuel on one side of her, who was now 10 and tall for his age, and Ida on the other, who was 8 and reading a book in the last of the evening light with complete absorption. He stopped his horse at the gate and looked at the three of them for a long moment before he dismounted, the picture of them in the golden September light, and he thought that this was the truest thing he had ever been part of. Delia looked up and saw him looking and said, "Are you going to stand there all evening or are you going to come in and have supper?" "I am coming in," he said. "I was just looking." "At what?" He unsaddled Calico and came up the porch steps and bent and kissed the top of her head and said, "All of this. You." Samuel made a face at this, which was appropriate for 10, and Ida did not look up from her book, which was appropriate for Ida, and Delia reached up and briefly held the hand that had settled on her shoulder with a grip that said everything it needed to say. They had a second son in 1885. They named him Thomas, for the minister who had married them, and he arrived with considerably more efficiency than Samuel had, as though he understood the schedule and intended to respect it. He had Delia's brown eyes, and within months, her absolute stubbornness about being carried when he wanted to walk, which began earlier than either Samuel or Ida had attempted, and was accompanied by considerably more indignation at being overruled. John watched him one afternoon, 18 months old and furious at the injustice of not being allowed to attempt the porch steps, and said with complete conviction, "He is going to be a lawyer." "I think he might be right," Delia agreed, watching Thomas argue the porch steps case with all available body language. By 1886, the Abbott Ranch was a prosperous, well-regarded operation in a well-regarded family, in a town that had grown considerably from the redemption of 1878. The Main Street had a proper hotel now, 2 new mercantile establishments, a bank that had improved its security following Harlan Briggs' multiple educational attempts, and a schoolhouse where Samuel and Ida and eventually Thomas spent their weekday mornings. Delia's library had outgrown the sheriff's office and moved into a dedicated room at the back of the new community hall, where it was tended by Ruth Caldwell's daughter Anna, who had inherited her mother's kindness and her father's organizational capacity, which was an excellent combination for a librarian. Ruth Caldwell herself, who had been Delia's first real friend in redemption and had remained her closest, was one afternoon walking with Delia through the edge of town, where the road bent south toward the ranches, and she said, "Do you remember that first day you arrived, with your carpetbag and that absolute composure about a man running out of the bank?" "I remember being considerably less composed on the inside," Delia said. "None of us would have known it. You just stood there against that wall looking like you were waiting for the whole business to sort itself out, which it did." Ruth smiled sideways at her. "And here you are." "Here I am," Delia agreed. "Happy?" Delia considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, because Ruth deserved serious answers and because the question itself was serious. She thought about the kitchen garden and the library, and the sound of Samuel arguing with Ida at the breakfast table, and Thomas attempting the stairs and John's hand on her shoulder in the September evening. She thought about the way John looked at her, still after 8 years, the same open and unhurried attention, and the way it still caught her slightly off guard sometimes, not because she doubted it but because it was still so full. She thought about what she had come from, that small, careful life in the rooming house in St. Joseph, and before that the quiet, hollowing absence of her first marriage, and she thought about what it felt like now to be so thoroughly, unmistakably present in her own life. "Yes," she said, and the word came out with a simplicity and certainty that surprised even her. "Yes, I am." The autumn of 1887 brought a late-season drought that stressed the pastures and shortened tempers throughout the county, but the Abbott Ranch had a water access on the creek that held steady through it, and the herd came through better than many neighbors managed. They shared what they could, letting 2 of the smaller neighboring families run some cattle on the better-watered portions of the Abbott Range through the driest weeks, which was not nothing. It was a real cost and a real choice, and John made it without discussion because it was simply what you did. Delia made it with him, the same way she made every decision with him now, both of them present at the table and both of them meaning it. Samuel, who was 11 that fall, began spending Saturday mornings with Walt learning the particular skills of cattle management that went beyond what his father's more law-focused life had given him time to teach in detail. Walt, who had moved from reserve to simply quiet over the years in a transition that mostly expressed itself in slightly longer sentences, took this seriously and taught it well. Delia watched Samuel come back from those Saturday mornings with his boots dirty and his face bright and thought she recognized in him the same thing she had recognized in herself at that age, the deep satisfaction of being useful, of having a skill that met the world directly. Ida was a different creature entirely, interior and bookish and so precisely observant that she made adults slightly nervous at dinner parties, which Delia found magnificent. She had a gift for mathematics that exceeded anything the current school was equipped to teach her, and Delia had written to a college in Austin to ask about correspondence courses, a letter that had required a certain amount of careful construction, because asking about academic correspondence for a 9-year-old girl was not a standard request in 1887. The response had been cautiously positive, and Delia was pursuing it with the same patient tenacity she brought to everything she had decided mattered. John watched her write the third follow-up letter one evening and said, "What happens when she actually needs to go to the college?" "Then we will work it out," Delia said, without looking up from the letter. "Yes," he said with absolute certainty. "We will." That winter, on a quiet January evening when the children were in bed and the house was the particular still and warm it became in the cold months, John came and sat beside her on the settee in the posture that she had come to recognize as meaning he wanted to say something he had been thinking about. She set down her sewing and gave him her full attention, which she had always done and which he had always valued in her, the genuineness of her presence when she chose to be present. "I want to tell you something," he said. "All right." He was quiet for a moment, organizing it, which was also him. "When Clara died, I spent a long time thinking that the best part of my life had already happened. Not dramatically, not in a way I talked about, just as a quiet understanding I had come to. That the good was behind me." He looked at her directly. "I need you to know that I understand now that I was completely wrong about that. The best part of my life is sitting right here with me." Delia felt the words settle into her the way warm water settles, complete and encompassing. She reached out and put her hand on the side of his face, her palm against his jaw, and he turned slightly into it the way he always did, without thinking. And she thought about all the days between that first afternoon when he had walked across the street toward her with his hat in his hand, and this one. All the ordinary, extraordinary days of a life fully lived. And she felt the profound and quiet certainty of a woman who has found exactly what she was looking for. Not because it was given to her, but because she had been brave enough and honest enough to go and find it. "John Abbott," she said softly, "yes, you are the best decision I ever made." He put his hand over hers where it rested against his cheek and held it there. "Delia," he said, and her name in his mouth had the weight of all 8 years and the lightness of all the years still ahead of them. In the spring of 1888, they planted a new section of the kitchen garden, extending it east along the wall of the house's addition, and Samuel helped, and even Thomas, who was 3, and contributed more enthusiasm than productivity, but whose enthusiasm was genuine and loud and wonderful. Ida sat on the fence with a book and periodically provided commentary about optimal planting depths, which she had been reading about, and Walt stood and watched the whole operation with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who has seen a great deal of life and has landed somewhere he had not expected, and is satisfied with it. Emilio and Rosalinda had a baby of their own by then, a boy they named Juan, who spent considerable time at the Abbott house because the two families had become genuinely entwined in the way of people who have been through enough together that the boundary between them has softened. Delia held Juan sometimes with the practiced ease of a woman who had held 3 of her own, and Rosalinda, and she talked at the kitchen table in the mix of Spanish and English. They had developed over the years into a working and affectionate language between them. The legal world continued to grind along in its slow and important way, and Amos Bellard, who was now quite old but no less sharp, had won 3 more cases against land interests that had attempted variations on Consolidated's approach, each case building on the record of the one before. He had come to supper at the Abbott Ranch one evening that spring and spent 2 hours talking about water law with John and Delia, and then looked at them both across the remnants of the meal with his spectacles in his hand and said, "I am glad you came to redemption, Mrs. Abbott. This county is better for it." "I am glad I came too," Delia said simply. The summer of 1888 was the best summer the ranch had seen. The rains timed perfectly, the cattle prices strong, the children brown and loud, and full of the particular energy of childhood in the open air. John taught Samuel to ride Calico properly, with attention to balance and the horse's signals, because Calico was old now and more patient than he had been, and the sight of his son on the horse that had been his for all these years gave him something he could not put into words but did not need to. Delia watched from the fence and felt the long, unbroken thread of it, from that first morning when she had ridden out to the ranch beside him on the bay mare, and he had glanced at her settling into the saddle with that brief nod, all the way to this August afternoon and the boy on the paint horse, and the man watching him with careful, shining pride. Thomas climbed her leg to see better, and she hoisted him up and held him on the fence rail with both arms around him, and he pointed at his brother on the horse with tremendous authority and said, "My turn." "When you are older," she said. "Now," Thomas said firmly. "Later," she said, equally firm. He considered this negotiation unsuccessful but final, which, at 3, he was beginning to understand was sometimes how things went, and settled in the circle of her arms to watch his brother with only a moderate amount of resentment. John looked across the corral at her, and she looked back at him, and the look was everything, the whole of it, the morning they had arrived at each other and every morning since. By the end of that year, John's appointment as district sheriff was renewed for a 3rd term, a fact that was largely expected and yet celebrated in redemption with a genuine warmth that spoke to what he had built there, not just in law but in the texture of daily life, the way people trusted the place more because of him. There was a small gathering at Harmon's, which had expanded in the years since Delia's first supper there and now had proper tables with chairs rather than benches, and Ruth Caldwell gave a speech that was brief and correct and made several people cry, which was the measure of a good speech. Delia sat beside John at the head table, and at one point he leaned slightly toward her, in the noise of the room, and said quietly, "Are you glad you answered that advertisement?" She turned and looked at him, this man with the sun-darkened skin and the honest face and the star on his chest and the dark eyes that were entirely hers, and she said, "Every single day." He took her hand under the table and held it through the rest of the evening, and she let him, and they sat together in the noise and warmth of their community, and were exactly where they were supposed to be. Redemption grew into the 1890s with the slow confidence of a town that had made enough good decisions to believe in its own future. The school expanded. A second doctor came, joining Mary Hendricks, who had finally accepted an offer from the town to build a proper infirmary rather than operating from her front room. The church added a second service on Sunday mornings to accommodate the congregation. The library moved again, into its own dedicated building on Pecan Street, which was entirely Delia's doing, and which she supervised with the same focused attention she had brought to every project of her life. On the day the library building was dedicated, a crisp October morning in 1891, the whole town was more or less present, and Thomas Caldwell, who was still minister though considerably older, gave the dedication with the same economy of words he had used at John and Delia's wedding and several hundred other events in the intervening years. Afterward, standing in the doorway of the new building with the smell of fresh lumber and the rows of books visible behind her, Delia found herself standing beside John in the October air, Samuel on his other side, now 17 and as tall as his father, Ida 14, and already in correspondence with 2 universities about her mathematics, Thomas 9, and engaged in something suspicious near the back fence with 3 other boys his age. "You should be very proud," John said to her. "We should be very proud," she corrected. "You made this possible too." "You made this," he said, "properly speaking." She thought about that for a moment, about what she had made, the library and the garden and the 3 faces that were partly hers and partly this man beside her and entirely themselves, and the home she had built in this town that had not been hers and was now as much hers as anywhere had ever been. She thought about the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in 1878 with a carpetbag and a careful heart, and she felt a deep and grateful affection for that woman, for her stubbornness and her honesty and her willingness to step toward something she could not entirely see yet. She tucked her hand into the crook of John's arm, and he covered it with his, and they stood together in the doorway of the thing she had made, while their children moved around them, and the town moved around them, and the October light came down clean and golden on all of it. They were, in the fullest sense of the word, home. The years that followed were not without their difficulties, because no life is, but they were years of substance and love, and the particular contentment that comes to people who have built something true. Samuel eventually took over the eastern portion of the ranch when he was 22, working it with the combination of Walt's practical teaching and his own considerable capability, marrying a young woman named Clara, which made his parents exchange a look that contained more than they needed to say, a quiet, graceful nod to what had come before. Emilio's family remained close to the Abbotts in all the ways that mattered, their children growing up between the two households as naturally as any cousins. Ida went to Austin at 17 and came back at 22 with a mathematics degree that was the first of its kind for a woman from that county, and Delia was at the stage depot in Redemption when she arrived, wearing the same expression her mother had worn stepping off the stage 20 years before, steady and composed and full of things she had not yet said. And Delia opened her arms and held her daughter and thought she had never been more proud of anything in her life. Thomas did, in the end, become a lawyer. He read for the law in Austin at 20 and was practicing in Redemption by 24, with exactly the argumentative precision John had identified in him at a year and a half and the particular stubbornness that was entirely his mother's. He was good at it. He cared about it. He applied it, when he had the choice, to the cases that needed good law the most, the ones that involved the small and the overlooked and the wrongly pressured. He was, Delia thought on more than one occasion, her son in the way that mattered most, not in features or temperament but in the fundamental direction of his attention. John retired as district sheriff in 1895, at 50. Not because the work had broken him, but because the next generation of the county needed to run its own affairs, and he had always been, beneath everything, a man who understood when to step back and let something become what it needed to be. He handed over the star to a deputy he had trained for 6 years and whose integrity he trusted completely, and he came home to the ranch that afternoon and found Delia in the kitchen garden, where she still spent more time than she needed to because she still loved it, and he sat on the garden wall and watched her work. "Well," she said without looking up. "Well," he agreed. "How does it feel?" He thought about it seriously, which she had always loved about him, that he took the questions she asked seriously. "It feels like finishing something correctly," he said, "and being able to look at what's next." She looked up from the garden bed. "What is next?" He smiled, and it was the same smile she had seen for the first time in the street in 1878 and had been watching for ever since, brief and warm and entirely real. "Whatever we decide," he said. She stood up and brushed the earth from her hands and crossed the garden to where he sat on the wall, and he moved to make room for her, and she sat beside him in the afternoon light, both of them looking out at the ranch in its autumn gold, the horses in the corral and the smoke from Emilio's chimney in the middle distance, and the long, beautiful reach of the Texas sky above everything. "I think we should travel," she said. "We have never gone anywhere simply for the pleasure of going." He looked at her with interest. "Where?" "I don't know yet," she said. "Somewhere we haven't been. That seems like enough of a reason." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him in the way she had learned to lean into him, fully and without reservation, the way you lean against something you are absolutely certain will hold. "All right," he said. "Wherever you want to go." And that, Delia thought, was exactly it, exactly the thing, the simplest and most complete thing. Not all her questions answered at once, not any guaranteed map, but a man beside her who meant every word he said and would go wherever she decided to go and would come home with her after. and a life built stone by stone out of honesty and care, and all the ordinary, extraordinary days that added up to something so much larger than she had imagined possible when she had stood in a rooming house in St. Joseph and read 4 lines in a newspaper and written, with a careful and hopeful hand, the first letter of a life she had not quite begun yet. She had arrived in redemption with a carpetbag and a careful heart. She had filled both.